The negotiations are at an intense phase. It's a complex negotiation, but the assurance for Canadian business, for Canadians, is we will only sign a deal that's the right deal, that's a good deal for Canada.
Hello there, this is Power in Politics. I'm David Common in Ottawa. It is the final sprint of Canada-U.S. trade talks, with 4 days remaining before President Donald Trump has vowed to slap a 35% tariff on all non-CUSMA goods. We're going to find out where those talks stand from former Quebec Premier and current PM advisor Jean Charest. That's just ahead. Plus, Elections Canada is changing how people will vote in next month's by-election after more than 200 candidates signed up to run against Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. For most of them, it's a stunt intended only to make a statement. We will speak to one of those longest ballot candidates about his message. And there's a new diplomatic push for a ceasefire in the Middle East. As starvation grips Gaza, dozens of ministers are at the United Nations pleading for a two-state solution. We will hear how dire the conditions have become. Power in Politics starts right now. The United States has struck another major trade deal that could set a precedent for Canada. The European Union agreed to a framework deal that imposes a 15% baseline tariff on most goods. That mirrors a framework agreement between the U.S. and Japan that happened last week. It saw that country also agree to a 15% tariff. That, as the clock is ticking for a deal between Canada and the U.S. by Trump's August 1st deadline. That is this Friday.
Industry, businesses, Canadians, they are anxious and they are concerned. They don't deserve the uncertainty that's been thrust upon them. They don't like it. They like resolution, but they'd also like they want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada, that makes sense for Canadian business, for Canadian workers. There is a landing zone that's possible, but we have to get there, and we'll see what happens.
Jean Charest, the former Premier of Quebec. He's also a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations. Jean Charest, good day to you.
Good day, David.
You are getting the briefings. Presumably the rest of us aren't. What are the chances of actually getting a deal by Friday?
Well, David, you and everyone else are probably on the same page right now. We just don't know whether that will happen on Friday. It may not. Both Mr. Trump and now Prime Minister Carney have said that it may not happen on Friday, and if it doesn't, well then we just continue to talk and negotiate.
So the question, of course, is so much of what we trade right now is actually covered by CUSMA, by our free trade deal. If we don't have a new deal by Friday, is it only products that aren't covered by the deal that would then presumably get tariffed, or would it be everything?
Well, if CUSMA will continue to apply, that my understanding is, let's assume that there's no deal on Friday and that Mr. Trump decides to move on Friday. Because he doesn't have to. He can say, we'll continue to talk until we resolve this. And there would be a 35% tariff. Well, then CUSMA would continue to apply. And there would be a majority of merchandise that is now exported to the United States that would be tariff-free because it's under the umbrella of CUSMA. And we don't have an exact number, by the way. No one has an exact number of what percentage, but it's certainly north of 56%, maybe all the way up to 80% of products that are CUSMA treated and thus no tariffs. And the reason why we don't know very well is because this information we don't in Canada register what goes out of the country. It's the Americans who have the numbers on what comes in. So CUSMA would typically continue to apply.
What would be the products or the services that are produced here in Canada that would be most exposed if on Friday we don't have a deal?
Well, it's the ones already pretty prominent that are not under CUSMA, and that's steel at 50%, aluminum at 50%, oil and gas is at 10%, and potash is at 10%, and then you have autos at 25%, but 25% of everything that is not made in the United States from an auto product going into the United States because of the integration of the market. And it's all a little complicated, yes, but that essentially would be the big ticket items. And they're costly. I mean, even if a majority of products are exempted, there's a lot of pain in those sectors of the industry for steel and aluminum, and for the lumber industry in particular that's also very vulnerable. So the sectors that are affected are paying a high price for what's happening.
There are other countries out there that are getting deals. We've seen the European Union just over the course of the weekend, Japan before that. Both of them accepted 15% baseline tariffs. Is that just the model we're going to have to stomach?
The Japan deal is really a marker, David. When the Japan deal came out, everyone took a pause and sort of concluded that the line of sight of what the Trump administration is going to end up with is probably around the Japan deal, which is a baseline level of tariffs at 15% with developed countries in particular, I'm thinking, and with some exemptions included. And then the Trump administration has this method of tagging on to the agreements investment commitments by the partner countries. They've done that with Japan, they've done that with Europe. And they had done it previously in their first mandate with China. You may remember that they had signed trade agreements with China where China had committed to buying more agricultural products in particular, and that didn't happen at the end of the day. So all these things are framework agreements, by the way, where the details are not well known, they're not fleshed out. All of this is being done in a pretty rapid manner, so we're all a bit cautious of what it will mean in the end, what the final product will be. But the scenario we're looking at now is probably a baseline of 15% tariffs throughout the developed world, higher in certain developing countries, and that's what we're probably looking at in the case of Canada, with the exception, the difference being CUSMA, which protects a lot of the merchandise that we export to the United States. So we're in a position that's different, Canada and Mexico, than the rest of the world.
Does this show that Trump's, what we have called his bullying, his illegal acts, his attempt to extort an agreement out of other countries, does this show that it all worked?
Well, it's superpower politics is what it is, David. I mean, here we have a government, a Trump administration, who does not believe there is a global community, they've said that, and whose view of the world is that the world is an arena. And in the arena, there's no multilateralism and there's no consensus. There's a victor and there's the vanquished. That's what arena is about. That's their choice of words. At least goes back to 217. And they embrace that. They bring this. They bring great power and strength to this world. And for them, this is the way the world operates. So it's just the way it is. That means that we have to be smart. Really, you know, at the end of the day, David, we have to be very smart on how we defend our interests. We have to be strategic. And of course, the biggest lesson for Canada is that we also have to have a hard look at ourselves, our economy, the way our federation works, our position in the world. This is really a moment where we have to have a very hard look at how we have been operating as a country to be able to do the changes we need to do so that we can better deal with this, but also have more autonomy and better defend our interests.
Now, we thought we were being strategic, at least the federal government did, by using retaliatory tariffs. But the American economy is doing really well. The American consumer is, for the most part, not feeling the pain of counter tariffs. I look at GM, lost $1 billion in the last quarter, and yet never raised the price of an automobile because they're worried, presumably, that the president will tweet about them, will get out on social media about them. Does that mean that our strategy of retaliatory tariffs has failed?
I think it was the right strategy. China, ourselves, did that. You know, this European deal just concluded. The Europeans clearly signaled to the Americans that they had prepared a package of $90 billion euros worth of retaliatory tariffs. I do think you need to show some strength in that regard. Now, about the American economy, we're going to learn a lot about the American economy this week. A lot of numbers are going to be coming out in regards to employment, to a whole slew of numbers, including the GDP growth, and there will be the Fed will meet this week, and so will the governor of the Bank of Canada have to decide on interest rates. I would be careful in assuming that the American economy is doing as well as some people think it does. You know, the rules of physics apply to the economy as everywhere else, and at one point this is going to have an effect, an impact. And it may not have happened as rapidly as we thought or in the way we thought, but it will have an impact.
Before I let you go, I do want to ask you, because you are in Quebec, about supply management, particularly as it relates to dairy. The Americans have come at it before. They're coming at it again. What is the risk to dairy farmers in this country that supply management will be eroded to some degree?
Our government has been very clear on that. And by the way, there's a consensus on this in the House of Commons among all three parties. And, you know, the Americans also protect sectors like sugar, and the Farm Bill. Every country in the world, David, has sectors that they choose to protect. That's the reality of trade. Now, at the end of the day, 99% of everything that goes back and forth is tariff-free or is not protected. And in the case of dairy, or what we call supply management for eggs and poultry, is a choice Canada has made. And I think it's a legitimate choice, one that even Donald Trump recognized when he negotiated the last CUSMA agreement with Canada in 2018.
Jean Charest, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, David.
So what should Canada do if no deal is reached and President Trump responds as threatened with more tariffs?
If he wants to attack our steel industry, our aluminum industry, other industries, we need to hit him back.
Not all premiers agree with that. They fear retaliation would only hurt Canadians. Later on this hour, the Power Panel on the state of these talks and what happens if they don't get a deal. First, though, as the situation in Gaza grows more desperate by the day, the United Nations has put a two-state solution back in the spotlight. Coming up, why the next few days could be make or break for Palestinians facing a hunger crisis. The World Health Organization says the number of people dying of starvation in Gaza is growing. The UN's aid chief is warning that the coming days will be make or break for humanitarian efforts as Israel begins 10-hour military pauses to allow aid to be delivered.
Look, yesterday was a start. It's a drop in the ocean of what's needed. During the ceasefire, for those 42 days, we were getting in 600, 700 trucks a day. Yesterday, it was fewer than 100.
Israel, along with Jordan and the UAE, resumed plane drops of supplies yesterday. That is something aid groups have criticized in the past as ineffective and dangerous, all while the humanitarian situation worsens. Sana Beg is the executive director of Doctors Without Borders Canada and joins us now. Sana, good day to you.
Thank you. Nice being here.
Well, I'm glad to have you, just for your expertise in particular. You heard the UN's aid chief there, Tom Fletcher, saying that the aid that's gone in during these past pauses has been basically a drop in the ocean relative to the need. How would you describe the situation in Gaza now?
Well, to describe the situation now, you really have to look back at the last 2 years of this devastating man-made engineered crisis, where we've seen nearly 2 years of engineered moments of micro breakdowns that are now resulting in a macro collapse on several fronts, as it relates to humanitarian aid, as it relates to mental health, as it relates to the entire ecosystem that people in Gaza rely on for their daily survival. You're absolutely right to point out that we are one of at least 100 or so credible international humanitarian aid organizations that are critiquing the provision of airdrops into Gaza. This is a mere distraction, as we have seen many of over the course of what we're seeing unfolding in the occupied Palestinian territories. You have the roads that exist. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of trucks lined up literally just outside of Gaza on the Rafah crossing, waiting to enter with the amount that is needed to make a dent in the needs, the caloric intake that is required of the Palestinian people at this stage today. You have to understand what we were putting in when the last time there was a brief momentary pause. To be able to get in 500 trucks or so at that moment was sufficient to meet the needs of populations. Today, you have to understand we will have to now deal with people that have been dealing with prolonged durations of being malnourished. And so to be able to carefully refeed them back, to be able to rehabilitate them back and do that in a careful, sustainable way is going to require another gargantuan exercise.
Why does the UN call this week make or break?
I'm sorry?
Why does the United Nations call this week make or break when it comes to the food, the hunger crisis in Gaza?
Well, quite simply, we're at a tipping point, aren't we? You are seeing disturbing images of skeletal babies in the arms of their mothers who are malnourished themselves and cannot breastfeed their children. You're seeing children in that critical phase of the first 100 days of their lives being severely, acutely malnourished. That is going to have lifelong consequences if sustainable, accurate amounts of the food that is required and the supplies that are needed to reach these populations is not met in the next couple of days, if not today, immediately, you will see mass starvation and mass deaths by starvation.
So when you have a plane, which can't carry as much as a convoy of trucks, but when you have a plane that drops a pallet of food, or you get 100 trucks in instead of 700 or 800 trucks, what kind of difference are you making on the ground?
We've long been saying that any sort of a mechanism that is outside of letting trucks in, the amount that we need in, is merely going to be a trickle in the vast ocean of needs that exist in Gaza. You cannot, for one, control the quality or the volume of food that you can bring in via airdrops in comparison to 2,000 tons or more that you can get in through road transport into Gaza. The second situation that you have to consider is that these airdrops can happen in locations that are not in the specified green zone. So it can very well lead to a chaotic situation, a survival for the fittest, where people will have to scramble, as we have seen in other cases before as well, scramble to get handful of aid that is clearly never going to meet the needs of the vast majority of people that need that aid.
In short, if
You know, and I can tell you as well, you know, what our teams are seeing on the ground, the impossible choices that we have to make. We have Canadian staff that work in Gaza today, and my colleagues that are there have been telling us about the difficult choices we have to make on a regular basis. You know, we have to choose between who to give highly nutritious food to. We have to decide who is quote unquote malnourished enough to be able to receive that aid. Heartbreaking choices that no one should have to make.
Do you get to a point where, and this sounds very callous as I'm going to say it, do you get to a point where the level of hunger is so great, the level of malnourishment is so great, that you would choose somebody who is in better shape?
I can tell you that there is a real moral injury that our staff are dealing with every day. Choices such as the one that you're portraying here, in addition to the multitude of other choices we've had to make. Look, our staff as MSF, alongside others in the aid sector that are working tirelessly in Gaza, they haven't had food in days. They struggle themselves while providing life-saving care to find one meal a day. And is that meal nutritious? Is that able to meet the daily nutrient requirements that you need? Very likely no. And they're making those difficult choices on hungry stomachs and trying to save lives on a daily basis. So do difficult choices have to be made? Absolutely, on a near daily basis.
What are you looking for from the international community? Because we saw last week a couple of dozen countries, Canada included, saying this has to open up, Israel has to open up, there has to be more food going in. You've also seen the United States come back today and just reject the two-state solution conference, not even a two-state solution, but the conference that's underway right now. What are you calling for the international community to do, and what is realistic to call upon them to do?
Well, isn't it realistic to denounce international humanitarian law violations as Canada has done? And it's time for those words to be backed up with action. So an immediate ceasefire, of course, we have been calling for that for 2 years now. But we need to also be able to have real conversations about how to impose real consequences on Israel, either as Canada or in partnership with other governments and actors. And also from a Canadian perspective, ensure that no Canadian arms trade is being used to fuel war crimes. Those are our specific asks to the Canadian government, and Canada has a long history of being a real player in international humanitarian law and on the global stage. And we're asking for that legacy to speak for itself and for actions to be backed by the Canadian government today.
Sana Beg, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Sana Beg is the Executive Director of Doctors Without Borders. There's a new diplomatic push today for a ceasefire and stability in the Middle East. It is that United Nations conference which is reviving the concept of a two-state solution involving Israel and the Palestinians. The war in Gaza has been ongoing for now nearly 22 months. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand spoke at the United Nations early this evening outlining Canada's position.
Canada remains firmly committed to a two-state solution, an independent, viable and sovereign Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace and security. Canada supports the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, and we endorse the principle of Palestinian statehood. We shall continue to discuss with the Palestinian Authority the next steps in our relationship. A workable Palestinian state needs legitimate, democratic governance that serves all Palestinian people. Crucially important is the Palestinian Authority's commitment to undertake the comprehensive reforms necessary to govern Gaza and the West Bank. To that end, today, Canada is pledging an additional $10 million this year to accelerate reform and capacity building for the Palestinian Authority. Canada's commitment to a two-state solution is rooted in our desire to see the Palestinian people living with freedom and dignity, and to see Israelis live in peace and security also. In this light, this path is not only the most just course, it is the only sustainable one. À Gaza, la situation humanitaire est catastrophique. De nombreux Palestiniens meurent de faim, sont tués en tentant d'accéder à la nourriture
They're killed
et à
as they're
l'eau,
trying to obtain
ou
food
lors
and water,
d'opérations
or
militaires qui
during
ont
a
fait de
military
nombreuses
operation
victimes.
which resulted in
Et
numerous
ceux qui
victims.
survivent sont
And those who
exposés à des
survive
maladies
are
évitables
exposed to
et à la
avoidable
mort.
disease
C'est
and death.
unacceptable.
This is unacceptable.
We condemn the continued detention of hostages held captive by Hamas since the 7th of October 2023, and we call for their immediate and unconditional release. Hamas must immediately and unconditionally release all hostages. Hamas can have no role in Gaza's future governance. Israel's right to live in peace and security with its neighbors has long been and continues to be a key principle of Canada's Middle East policy. I believe this right must be recognized by all partners who are committed to peace. To this principle must be joined our shared commitment to Palestine's right to live in peace and security also. Joined by international partners, Canada also recently condemned the ongoing civilian suffering. We condemn the inhumane killing of civilians, including children. We condemn the ongoing expansion of settlements and settler violence in the West Bank. And we condemn the forced displacement of the Palestinian population. The actions outlined just now are all violations of international humanitarian law. We urge all partners to continue to support a principled response through non-governmental humanitarian organizations, organizations with proven capacity to deliver humanitarian assistance at scale. Canada has committed more than $315 million in humanitarian aid to Gaza, making us the third largest bilateral donor in response to this crisis. This includes support to the World Food Program to address critical food assistance needs, support to the International Committee of the Red Cross, Red Crescent to provide emergency medical care and protection, support to UNICEF to deliver urgent nutritional supplies to malnourished children, and support to other experienced humanitarian partners and NGOs as well.
Minister Anand also announced an additional $30 million in aid for Palestinians in Gaza. Next month's federal by-election in Alberta will be the most crowded race in Canadian history, and it's forcing Elections Canada to make some big changes. Up next, we will speak to one of the candidates running against Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, not to win necessarily, but as a sign of protest. Elections Canada is responding to the record-breaking number of candidates set to run in the upcoming by-election in Battle River-Crowfoot. Albertans voting in that by-election will now do so using an adapted ballot. Elections Canada says voters must write the name of their preferred candidate in a blank space provided on the new ballots. This system will replace the typical list-style ballot, where voters usually mark in a circle next to the name of the candidate of their choice. The move comes today as 209 candidates are currently set to run in the August by-election, including Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Most of those people are part of the longest ballot committee. It is an electoral reform advocacy group, and one of the people who will be on that ballot against Pierre Poilievre is Mark Mutter. He joins us now. Mark, how are you?
Hi, good, and you?
I am well. So if I look at the last race that was involved here, Carleton, this is an example of the ballot from that race. It's long. You were one of 91 candidates on this ballot in that spring election. For Battle River, I can't even get it assembled here on my desk. There's more than twice as many for the Alberta by-election. So they're switching to this adapted ballot. What is the initiative? What is your group hoping to achieve by doing this again?
We are hoping to get our politicians out of the decision-making process of the way our elections are run. As of right now, our politicians essentially game the system, which is first past the post, in which they decide the rules and they have no motivation to change the system. And we're hoping to change that.
Are you hoping to change by getting to proportional representation, or you're trying to get to what?
There's a lot of different views in the group. I always like saying it's a very decentralized group of people. I personally like proportional representation, and I believe that there are systems that actually play very well with our current system, which allow for an easy adaptation, where you can slowly sort of shift towards a more democratic system.
Either way, what you're talking about as a group is electoral reform, and I get that some people will look at it differently. I wonder, though, given what now Elections Canada is doing in making this special ballot where you just write your name in, is it undercutting your protest in some ways?
I don't think so. We've had more than 2 times more people on the ballot than last time during the general federal elections. And the fact that we've had so many people reaching out and wanting to get their names on the ballot is showing that there's actually a record number of people who are interested in the initiative. There's a record number of people who are dissatisfied with our current electoral system. So we're seeing more and more people learning about this.
The Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, is among some who are criticizing the move, saying it's bad for democracy. He argues it's making it harder for people to vote. Do you see that it could be a source of frustration for voters showing up and potentially facing a list of names like that?
From my personal experience, I wouldn't see it as a form of frustration. Last year, when I participated in the by-elections in Montreal, there were also 90 people on the ballot, and people weren't really frustrated at the ballot box. A lot of people were actually really interested in this, and I had a lot of interesting conversations with people. And I do not think that this actually led to results taking much longer to be tallied up in the end of the night. People were saying prior to the general elections that the long ballot is going to be catastrophic for the time for workers to count the votes. And yet, ironically, it is the ridings where there were really close candidates running together, which weren't impacted by the longest ballot that took the longest to count, of showing how frustrating and how incompetently designed our current system is.
You are running once again against Pierre Poilievre. You did so along with a number of others in your group in Carleton. Now you're doing it in Alberta once again. Is this about him?
This is not about him. This is about politicians as a whole. As a reminder, the previous Liberal government under Justin Trudeau promised us electoral reform and backtracked. So this isn't a question of political parties. This is not a question of Liberals or Conservatives. This is a problem with politicians we're electing directly into government, regardless of party, who have no motivation to change the system.
Pierre Poilievre has complained to the federal government, to Government House Leader Stephen McKinnon, and he has said, this is not democracy in action. It is a deliberate attempt to manipulate the rules, confuse voters, and undermine confidence in our elections. And to that, the federal government, Stephen McKinnon, has responded and said, our government shares the concerns about the longest ballot initiative, and we're currently examining the issue. If the result of that is that there is electoral reform, what you have called for, but that it is different than the electoral reform of the kind you've talked about, that it makes it harder for groups like yours to get on the ballot, makes it harder for everybody to get on the ballot, will you have been a victim of your own success?
I don't think so. We are going to find ways to keep pushing on the government regardless. What's currently happening is basically a form of patchwork on our broken system. And instead of addressing the really deep systemic issues of our electoral system, we're seeing these really quick fixes, which are very undemocratic. And I believe one of the proposals by the Conservative Party leader, there's an increase in the amount of signatures required to run in any riding. And that would make it basically impossible for independents and novelty candidates to run in a lot of ridings all over Canada. So
it would, to be clear, it would raise it from about 100 to, in the average riding, somewhere in the area of 600. You think that's too big a hill to climb, getting 600 signatures in order to run in a federal riding?
Well, the very problem is that the proposal is to become 0.5% of the total population of the riding. So it's incredibly easy in an urban area to go get, let's say, 0.5% when everybody's clumped together in a city. But in ridings like Battle River-Crowfoot, where we've had volunteers going out and gathering signatures for the initiative, which everybody's a volunteer here, it's incredibly challenging. And if we were to increase this from 100 currently to however many is going to be in a lot of rural ridings, that would make it impossible for independents to run. And that is undemocratic.
Mark Mutter, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
That is Mark Mutter, who's part of the longest ballot committee. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper has some advice for the Carney government as the Friday trade deadline approaches. Coming up, we will show you those remarks made by Harper today in Saskatoon. The Power Panel standing by with their take. Prime Minister says trade talks with the U.S. have entered an intense phase As the clock winds down to Friday's deadline, one of Mark Carney's predecessors, Stephen Harper, spoke about those talks today, saying the federal government sought his advice a few weeks ago.
My advice was, yes, on the economy, we've got to kind of get something short-term worked out with the Trump administration, but this really is a wake-up call for this country to truly diversify its trade export markets. The Trump administration is completely right to deal with some of its trade challenges, but declaring a trade war on 200 other countries at the same time? I mean, come on.
Some of this country's premiers also weighed in on the trade talks today and provided their own thoughts to the Prime Minister.
The United States just finished putting the boots to the EU, sticking their finger in their eye, telling them that they weren't pulling their weight, that they're a bad partner. We need to show up to all these countries that are getting done over by the United States and make sure that we're there to say we're a strong partner for you. We want to do deals with you.
I don't trust President Trump. He'll say one thing one day and say something else and then in the news the next day. We want a fair and free trade. But if he wants to attack our steel industry, our aluminum industry, other industries, we need to hit him back.
And with that, it is time to bring in our power panel. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Lisa Raitt, a former Conservative cabinet minister, and Brad Levine, a former national campaign director for the NDP. Good afternoon to all of you.
Hey. Hello, David.
Okay, the boilerplate answer for the Americans seems to be 15% tariffs for everyone. They did it with Japan. They've now done it just now with the EU. Jean Charest told us earlier, maybe that's where we're going to end up as well. Would it be a win if we landed there? Supriya, I'd start with you.
Probably not. I mean, look, everything is relative at the end of the day. So if we are looking at it comparatively to what other jurisdictions have gone through, then sure, yeah, okay. But I mean, the bar wasn't exactly set at 15% tariffs across the board for the most part, right? Like the bar was set that we would walk into this in a little bit more of an advantageous position than some other countries. To Premier Ford's point that he had made, I think it was today or earlier, talking about how much we actually export to the U.S. compared to a country like Japan. Like we are their number one customer, and you don't treat your number one customer the same way that you would all your other customers here.
There's also the question of what's going to be covered by what would inevitably be a framework deal if indeed we got one. And it doesn't seem like steel, aluminum, auto, or softwood would necessarily be part of that. If it's not, Lisa Raitt, then where does that leave Canadians?
Well, it leaves Ontarians in a really awkward position because they're the most trade exposed in all of those sectors. And that's probably why you're hearing Premier Ford have such strong language around what's happening right now. It is a very big concern in Ontario as to what's going to happen with the tariffs. I'm actually getting to the point where I'm thinking that maybe signing on the dotted line of a deal that's passed by our House and their Congress, maybe that isn't the best path for us to take, because perhaps we want something that can actually be undone by a future government or a future configuration of Congress or the House of Representatives. Because at this point in time, Mr. Trump can decide just to bring in his security clearance or his security kind of tariffs at any given moment, even if we sign something. And one thing I do know is that even if it isn't, I would say, good for Canada, the United States don't necessarily let you off the hook when it comes to having a deal with them. Even if it's not a great deal for your partner, they're not going to rewrite a deal. So maybe signing a deal isn't the path forward. I know it sounds contrary to everything we talk about, but maybe a tariff is a lot easier to be swept away than an actual deal.
Is that what Donald Trump wants? Brad?
No, I think what Donald Trump wants is those with whom the Americans trade to be in constant guesswork on their back heel, always wondering what the next move will be. And you know, he negotiates through the media in real time, where, you know, when it's at 35% or 50% tariffs and it comes down to a lower amount, maybe 15, then the recipient of that 15% tariff takes it as a win for them, when in fact that was his plan the whole time. You know, for success, whether it's on this Friday, the August 1st deadline, or if some kind of an agreement comes in the weeks ahead, looking at what other countries sign and then comparing us to that, I wouldn't do that. Your first question, to the panel, I wouldn't say that if we get what the Europeans got, we should be happy or we should be unhappy. We have a CUSMA agreement with the Americans already. They rely tremendously on the things that we provide them. Our economies are intertwined like no others. So I think we'll have to, plus our ability to backstop those sectors like the steel or the lumber or autos, our provincial and federal abilities to backstop those to help cushion the blows from these tariffs should all be looked at as to whether or not the ultimate deal is a good one or a bad one for Canada, as well as its duration. I think that's another component that we should be looking at.
Brad, I hear you when you say our economies are intertwined and they rely on us, and I've heard those lines for months on end. And I'm not saying they're not true, but I am looking at, I was just talking to Jean Charest about General Motors. They lost $1 billion plus in the last quarter. They have not raised the price of a car, and they're not doing that, so the American consumer is not feeling it. We don't have all the economic data out there, but have our counter tariffs, did that strategy work? Lisa Raitt.
Well, we have collected tariffs at the border. There's no question about it. So I think that it's a 1.5 billion. So something is being collected. And quite frankly, it was more of a sign. I think another symbolic sign, two things. One is the fact that we're not letting American liquor on our shelves has been an irritant for them, and it got their attention as well. I don't know whether or not, David, we can actually reach through the American economy and have a massive impact on the cost of goods going into the United States, but we can certainly make it uncomfortable for people who want to sell into Canada. And that's kind of what the purpose of the counter tariffs are. I want to add one thing. What I find fascinating about the clip from Prime Minister Harper is who he was talking to. And he was talking to American state legislature. That's what's interesting to me. Those are American lawmakers that he's talking to in very frank terms about whether or not this is a positive thing for the American government to pursue.
But do they have, and I go back to you, Lisa, on this, do they have any sway with the White House, even those who are directly attached to the MAGA Republican movement? We had some of them visiting Ottawa just last week, and here we are.
Not yet, but you have to have hope that one day that a pile of bad things are going to happen to such an extent that somebody is going to take a run after the president, and at that point in time, maybe other legislatures or maybe other legislators will end up jumping on that bandwagon, but not right now. But you got to keep putting that in front of them about the fact that it's not working out.
Supriya?
I mean, I don't disagree with Lisa. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think I would come back to what Premier Ford said in that clip that you showed, David, at the top of the panel, which was, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was essentially like, you can't trust what Trump says. He says one thing one day and then says something else the very next day. So his word and, his whole underpinning and strategy for this, there is really no rhyme or reason to any of it. I mean, even if you look at his entire ethos for why he's doing it, is it to bring back American manufacturing or certain industries, or is it to collect tariff revenue? Because if you're boasting about tariff revenue, then clearly the manufacturing, hasn't really been brought back since your people are paying tariffs. And it's just, it is quite confounding. And I think this is the real crux of the issue in dealing with Trump, is that he is not a rational actor in the way that you would assume a very close allied partner and, political leader would be for a country that we're so intertwined with.
Canada and the European Union have been so much in communication over recent months, trying to understand each other's strategy during these negotiations. Well, the EU has gone and cut a deal that early estimates say will cost the European Union 0.5% GDP in the next year. Has their willingness to do that deal, even if it's harmful to their own GDP, harmed our own chances? Any of you can jump at this.
I mean, I think to a degree, right? Because the EU basically capitulated to Trump. They ended up with a terrible deal. The only reason why they can purport it to be a win is because 15% is less than the 30% that was originally threatened. But that's not like a win for anyone, and we shouldn't pretend like it's a win.
Yeah, and on things like what the Europeans sell to the Americans, Americans will pay more for those European goods, so BMWs will cost more. We sell a heck of a lot more to the Americans and a much more diverse a range of products. So I would push back very hard to say that what the Europeans, that's their business. But again, going back to my original point, our economies and the things that they buy from us and the quantities they buy it from us are fundamentally different than any other market in the world.
They're also promising to buy a lot of weapons and make other investments in the U.S. Canada, Dominic LeBlanc has argued, is deeply invested in the U.S. already because of pensions and other stock funds. Would that be enough to convince the Americans? Lisa, I'll go to you. This is your world.
Yeah, you know what? I don't think that the EU or Japan or the UK, I don't think they have deals. I think they have announceables. And I don't know whether or not that's actually going to be put down into terms and conditions. And quite frankly, what happens if you're not adhering to the deal, some kind of dispute mechanism that's needed in anything that's a real deal. The only people who have a real deal is Canada and Mexico. We have our real deal that has to be figured into some kind of consideration. The rest of it, I think, are just the hopes of appeasing a president who wants to make an announcement that I made 90 deals in 90 days or whatever the heck the soundbite is. And that's basically it. I wouldn't put these on any kind of pedestal of it being a deal. And that's why it's dangerous for Canada to agree to reconfigure CUSMA, which is a real deal, and have something else that's in the works, whereas everybody else is just kind of making announcements. And I guess as time goes by, we'll see more and more whether or not this is something that the other countries are doing just to appease Mr. Trump and trying to make their way to the next midterm elections and wonder whether or not the Republicans in this form are going to hang on.
I want to talk to you about our own elections here for a moment, and particularly the by-election coming up and the crazy long ballot that might have been with 209 names on that ballot. I say might have been because now Elections Canada has decided it'll be more like the write-in ballot that you get if you go directly to the Elections Canada office. That's their workaround. The whole point of the longest ballot initiative was to try to push for electoral reform. Different people within that group have different definitions of what they'd like to see. What does this say about that initiative, the way in which Elections Canada is trying to confront it? Pierre Poilievre calling on the federal government to change the rules around what it takes to get on the ballot. Where do you stand? Supriya, I'd start with you and go through all three of you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think what they're doing is essentially incredibly anti-democratic. Like, the whole point of being pro-democracy is you're trying to alleviate barriers and to make it as easy as possible for folks to vote. You don't want to jam a ballot with a gajillion names on it so that you have, folks having to go through a list of names to figure out where the person that they want to vote for.
Although they're arguing the hypocrisy is the point. To show.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. But if the hypocrisy is the point and a bunch of old people can't vote or somebody who English isn't their first language, I don't know if you're doing what you actually set out to do. And I don't know if the Elections Canada adapted ballot, I realized they had to do something, but I don't know if that's going to assuage any concerns here. And I think we should all be just sending thoughts and prayers to the scrutineers involved because it's going to be a bit of a nightmare, I'd imagine.
I would think so. Okay, got a minute left. Lisa, to you.
Really quickly, I don't think the person that you interviewed had ever knocked on a door in their entire life, so they have no idea whether or not the electorate is actually going to be impacted by this super long ballot because, of course, as Supriya pointed out, they will. Senior citizens do vote, and unfortunately, sometimes we have to make it as easy as possible for them to make sure that they exercise their franchise. And I think anytime you try to monkey around with somebody's ability to vote, I think it's bad news, and I hope that they figure something out to do with it. If they want to fix the system, put your name on a ballot, found yourself a party, and run on a platform and get elected to do it. Otherwise, stop trying to make it hard for people to vote.
You want to get in there, Brad?
Effective protests, David, bring people in. They want to know more about what you're doing. They should be inviting and welcoming. I think what this does is push people away. I don't know what impact it'll have on this by-election, but if it's twice as long as the ballot you showed there, it's going to be a nightmare, and that's going to repel people from your cause, and it's going to, I think, undermine their whole point. So I'm glad Elections Canada is doing something.
Thank you very much to all three of you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, David.
You too.
Thanks very much to our power panel, Supriya Dwivedi, Lisa Raitt, and Brad Levine. That is the ballot from the last time. And with that, I'm David Common. Thank you so much for watching Power in Politics. More right here on CBC News Network. Stick around.